With no more further comments, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks everybody for being here today. I'm Susan Letcher. I'm the Elizabeth Battles Newman Chair in Botany at COA, and I would describe myself, I guess, as a terrestrial ecologist, also a human ecologist. Not an artist in any meaningful or professional capacity. I'm really pleased to present to you today in defense of his master's thesis, Robert Haskell. Robert has a BFA in sculpture, thank you, from University of the Arts in Philadelphia in 2014. He works as a multidisciplinary artist in many media, particularly in metal, glass, and increasingly in collaboration with the natural world. And over the course of his thesis, Robert has developed a new approach to sculpture that is really exciting and that is really dynamic, and it speaks to the best of what human ecology and intersection of arts and sciences can be. So really pleased to have Robert with us today.
Thanks so much, Susan. Thank you everyone for being here. Really excited to share all this. So many of you have helped me so much to make this thing a success. So yeah, I'm just really excited to share what came out of it. So this thesis looked at an experimental approach called habitat sculpture. And this is using sculpture installations in developed areas like cities and towns as a kind of different way to bring in nature and increase green space a little bit. So I think of these sculptures as kind of visions of an alternative future where the built environment is much more infused with nature. So this is a little snippet from the thesis. I'll just read it. Habitat sculptures leapfrog the current moment by creating small bubbles where nature and the built environment are intertwined in ways that are currently impossible on larger scales. In habitat sculpture installations, this vision of a possible future is not only depicted, but is actively worked towards. By giving sanctuary to a diversity of wild creatures in the built environment, a living window is opened to a more harmonious existence. It's open to the human being. So this is accomplished by creating habitat structures, and these are structures that organisms need to survive, but are usually lacking in developed areas. So there's some examples in the little diagram on the right. So the exciting thing about this approach is the interactions between ecology and art and kind of the social dynamic of the work. So for instance, because these pieces are kind of visually attractive, they'll kind of draw public attention to organisms and ecological things that most people wouldn't pay attention to, and kind of really educate people. So I just did a couple diagrams kind of showing these interactions. There are also some kind of fundamental conflicts in this approach. So these sculptures are meant to be visually appealing, people want to go up and look at them, but a lot of creatures don't want people close to them. So there's kind of these conflicts that I got to really investigate in the thesis and kind of come up with solutions to. So things that are nests for skittish creatures, I'll just do landscaping that kind of creates a separation, and then things for people to come up and really look at will be targeted at insects and fungus and plants, things that will mind, So I've been trying this approach for a while. It's kind of an idea I've had for 10 years or so now. And these are some examples of past pieces, and I think they came out nice looking, and the concept was there, but they just didn't really live. They didn't, creatures didn't inhabit them. They weren't really interacting. It was just kind of an idea. So coming here, doing this thesis was really investigating the biology and ecology and how can this actually work? What do I actually need to do to make these sculptures reactive to different organisms and really functional level. So the main answer to that is imitating natural habitat structures. So there's this really great body of research I got to investigate of artificial habitat structures. So you can think of something like a birdhouse. It imitates a natural tree cavity. It kind of reproduces the structures in a way that creatures are like, okay, I can, there's no tree hollows around, but I can use this. So that's kind of the main method is investigating these natural structures. So I got to look at which ones are able to be reproduced in sculptures, which ones aren't. And I kind of broke them down into different physical forms that I can use in sculptures that will imitate these natural things. So the first category is concave shapes. So making sculptures that have these kind of hollows and little shelters, that provides shelter for nesting sites and roosting sites. So just kind of using those shapes in the sculptures will house animals and other organisms. So I got to look at different dimensions that are known to be used by different creatures. So if I wanted a sculpture that has a fissure, which is this one here, you can look at the research and what entry hole size do fissures use, what kind of cavity size do fissures use. And then I can use those dimensions in the sculpture to provide habitat and tolerate that creature. The other kind of category of concave shape are these little hollows, these little tunnels, and these are used by insects. So there are a lot of wood-boring insects, and they'll create these, I don't know if you can see these are kind of diagrams of the tunnels and galleries these things make. And once the beetles and other kind of boring insects are done with them, these galleries and tunnels become habitat to tons of other creatures. That's their home. I'm going to look for a leftover tunnel from a longhorn beetle. So because these things are lacking in the built environment, we destroy the trees that are full of these little tunnels. Making sculptures with these forms, I'm hoping will provide habitat. Another one is water-filled cavities. So I learned a lot about dendrotomata, are water-filled tree holes. So these are really important water sources for animals and plants in nature. And they're also pretty much absent from the built environment. So kind of incorporating forms and sculptures that will fill with water will provide a really necessary resource. So the other category, it's pretty similar to concave shapes, but I'm calling it interstitial spaces. So these are spaces between objects. And these are also used as shelters by a lot of different organisms. So these are cover objects. So a rock on the ground, a log, creates a moist microclimate underneath it. It's trapping the moisture that's coming up from the ground. And a lot of creatures will use those, specific little spaces. So there's a lot of research being done with artificial cover objects. So reptiles really like these pieces of metal that are laying on the ground because it helps them with regulate their heat. And this is actually an artificial rock made of cement that researchers made because these certain rocks for a certain endangered snake in Australia were just being taken for landscaping, and the snakes had nowhere to live and the population was crashing. So these researchers took a mold of a natural rock and kind of studied it to make sure that the snakes liked it, and they did. Another kind of interstitial space are these bark crevices. So this is a crevice nesting bird, but mostly these things are great bat roosting sites. So creating sculptures that have these little nooks and crannies will provide habitat. And also the interface between the sculpture and the ground is a really important point for habitat sculpture. Another kind of interstitial space you can think of as, you know, the little gaps and crannies and nooks inside like brush piles and rock piles. So researchers have been looking at ways to artificially create these things. A big theme in this research is that humans like to just tidy up the natural world until there's no habitat left. These structures are messy to most people. So in the built environment, even if no one's trying to intentionally go chop down a forest, get rid of all the habitat, whatever, we just kind of naturally like, oh, that's on the ground, let me just get rid of that. So these sculptures are bringing some mess, and hopefully doing it in a way by having these kind of fine art element to it, hopefully making the mess acceptable. So this is a rock pile for an endangered snake in southern Maine. There's just an idea I had for putting a sculpture of the snake on top of it, so people could kind of learn about it. Yeah. So another category of shapes are things with different layers in space. So this is a diagram. So this forest, all the trees are the same height. It kind of has this one canopy level. This one has 3 different levels, and then this one has many. And this kind of structure, there's going to be many more spaces for creatures to exist and to be kind of eking out their existence. So again, human developed areas are usually very simple. So having sculptures that have these many layers will kind of provide more habitat space. So this is just a sculpture idea kind of showing there's 1 layer here, there's 10 layers there. And yeah, so the forest is one example, and then rock kind of cliff faces are another, where creatures really respond to having these multiple levels of space. So then the last category is complex surfaces. So the things we make are usually just smooth and simple, asphalt, concrete, and in nature, surfaces are rough and they have a lot of crannies and stuff. So this is just kind of on a micro scale providing all these little niches for creatures to inhabit. So there's a lot of research done on this in the marine environment with restoration, kind of getting coral and other creatures to grow. There's not as much being done in the terrestrial environment, but I'm kind of really investigating that with sculpture to see if I can make these really rough surfaces and if those will kind of host life. And then there's some other interesting things, these patterns that mimic leaf structures will kind of concentrate moisture and kind of provide water to organisms that way. So that's just another thing I'm looking at. So these are some molds of these natural rough surfaces. So by kind of taking the forms that we know creatures inhabit, I'm kind of increasing my chances of success that, a spider really will find this cranny acceptable to hide out in and wait to jump out to eat something. So mold making was a really essential part of this project. So other things I found out were really important are materials, color, and then orientation. So these all affect kind of moisture environments and temperature environments. Creatures really need those to be specific to them. They have a certain way of retaining moisture and getting body heat, and having the right materials things have just different properties. And it was really learning what materials not to use. So I made something out of copper pipes, and it just heats up, and creatures don't really know how to respond to that. So instead, using things like dead wood, really absorbs moisture, it's thermally buffered, and then there's a lot of different research on like how different materials respond to life. So there's just a lot of research there to use. And then the other really essential thing for these sculptures is providing additional resources to the sculpture. So a sculpture by itself can't really fulfill all the needs of an organism. It can't be a complete home to most things. So having these sculpture, instead of a sculpture, it's a sculpture installation. And around it will be all these plants that are supporting what's in the sculpture, water sources, and that's just something I didn't really think about before when I was trying to make these sculptures. And I'm really glad I got to investigate that. This is just a little sketch of a sculpture interacting with a little water puddle. So the other method, and this is kind of different than imitating natural structures to create habitat, is this idea of using sculptures to protect habitat that already exists. So I focused a lot of this on dead wood. It was a really big theme in my research, was like finding out how ecologically active dead, decaying wood is. I think a lot of people know there are bugs in there and stuff, and there's moss that grows on it. But this food web, they're called saproxylid organisms, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But that's all the creatures in front of you on the tables really rely on dead, decaying wood to survive, and without it, they go extinct. And because we are removing, we just kind of instinctively remove dead, decaying wood, a lot of these creatures are declining and becoming endangered. So these are some sketches with ideas for sculptures that protect dead trees. But this idea could also apply to protecting rock piles and protecting different kinds of habitat. So it kind of physically surrounds it, protects it. But I think the more important thing is it's a signifier that this is an important thing to someone. This is something to pay attention to, and it's kind of an educational thing. Like, why is that? What's the sculpture about? Why do we do there? So some of them I kind of use this kind of sacred imagery. I think this last one kind of does that too. It's this gold and bronze coated form, and it's just kind of saying like, we value this. This is an important thing. So just to run through the major findings, the things that I came out of this with that I think are going to really help me be successful. So using mold making, so this is a morel mushroom that I took a plaster, a rubber mold up, and the surface is just so fantastic. So I had the idea to stretch the mold out and kind of create a sheet of this texture. So I can create, I'm thinking of a human form that just the whole surface is this morel texture. But also making molds of just entire objects like tree hollows, really replicating them and using them in the sculpture. That was an important thing. Using salvaged natural structures, so tree hollows and all sorts of things are just being thrown in wood chippers, thrown in dumpsters all the time. Once I kind of started looking for these things, they're just everywhere. So taking these and using them for sculptures are going to make it a lot more successful. And then materials, so getting to use highly decayed wood, it's called veneris wood, and it's just totally different from working with lumber. I've worked with wood a lot as a sculptor, and this stuff is almost more like clay. It's just like totally malleable. So coming up with all these ways to work with that has been interesting. Using different concrete mixes that are made to grow moss and support life. That's been another big thing. Like I talked about before, using specific measurements to target specific animals, that's been really important. And then seeing what actually happens. So I got to do, in my statistics class, a little monitoring of some tubes and seeing which animals ran in there. And this is a sculpture where some paper wasps set up shop, and it's like, really seeing what happens and then responding to it. I think it's going to be probably more important than designing the perfect sculpture. It's like, how does this actually interact with life? So I made some sculptures as part of this. The main one is in front of the Door Museum. That's what all these sculptures are for. And this tree was going to get removed when we redid the landscape to make it ADA accessible. And Isabel was looking out for me and asked them to keep the tree. And so this sculpture is here's some sketches. The concept is it's showing the organisms that are going to live in this tree. And it's kind of a food web, so the creatures lower down are kind of food for the creatures higher up. And I wanted it to just be full. So there's going to be about 120 of these little sculptures. And there's just such an incredible diversity of life in Deadwood. I wanted to really kind of overwhelm you with it visually and have all these bright colors just being like, look at all this stuff that's in there that you can't necessarily see. But the cool thing about this is you will be able to see some of the creatures, and you'll be able to see them next to a giant sculpture of themselves. So that's kind of the concept that I think is going to be really cool. These are just some sketches. I did some study of saprophytic insects and got to do some collecting and make sketches of them as they're crawling around. So that kind of fed into this the imagery for these sculptures. And then I got to do a planting plan around the sculpture to specifically, like, this is a flower longhorn beetle, and they live in the deadwood as larvae, and then when they become adults and emerge, they need certain plants for pollen and nectar. So all the plants around the sculpture are kind of targeted to this one, and some of the other ones where there's these interactions. Also some of the birds, there's like berries that cavity nesting birds I don't like, so I got to put them around the sculpture, and then I'm scattering some plantings in the woods to kind of create this connection from the sculpture to the environment. So I worked with students to create a lot of these. So all the three-dimensional sculptures you see here were created by students at my studio in Sweet Peas. And that was kind of another wanting to just show this big jumble of life and all these diverse creatures as having different artistic styles kind of put into it. So this is installing the steel spiral around the tree. It was a lot of work. I had a lot of people here put in a lot of hours with me to get this thing up. And here's some of the first creatures that I put on it. And the color palette's just very playful and childlike, and it's just gonna be this total rainbow when it's all up. And this is going to be finished in the fall. There's going to be an opening exhibit. There'll be some, I have an insect collection of deadwood insects that will be kind of displayed next to it. And just really excited to finish it up and get to that point. And already, just being out there and installing the sculptures, there's just an incredible, So this is a parasitoid wasp, and we have one here. They use these big, long ovipositor needles to stick into the dead wood and lay their eggs on the beetles that are inside of it. So and then the beetles hatch inside, or the wasps hatch inside them, eat them from the inside out. It's just this incredible thing, and it's so cool to be able to see them right there. I've seen probably 4 different species of these on the tree so far. And then a longhorn beetle. This is one of those ones that makes those little tunnels in the woods, so it's a really important habitat engineering. So that's been awesome to see. It's just already teeming with life, which is so much more than my previous attempts have been. So it's just really great to see it succeeding. Then some of the other sculptures I'm making are being installed at Design Group Collaborative in Ellsworth, which is an architecture firm that my mom has, and we've been kind of working together to create this sculpture garden where the sculptures are interacting with the life in the garden. And yeah, it's just kind of a platform to try out all these different techniques. So yeah, this sculpture has little cavities for solitary bees and wasps. It has concrete that's meant to grow things. This vine started climbing up this one, which I didn't expect, but it's just like wonderful to see these unexpected interactions. So I have a bunch of pieces in the works there that will hopefully I'll have some photographs I can display in the fall for kind of an exhibit. This is one of them. I was talking about this before. I used copper piping on this. This was kind of like early in the research, and it was meant to house chipmunks. So I'll just end with this little video. It was really cool. Outside my studio, there's a bunch of junk from people just throwing things there. And I noticed this chipmunk just loves running through this tube. It does it like a few times a day. And then I noticed that the opening of the tube is basically the same size as their natural, tunnels. So using that measurement on the sculptures, that was kind of the idea. It didn't quite work out, but I'm gonna just kind of retool it and go from there. And then, yeah, there's future projects. So I'm trying to do something in Philadelphia, kind of in the inner city area, because that's where I think this approach has a lot of promise to bring in nature to environments that are just really laid bare. I lived in Philly for a while, and it was just kind of a shock when I first moved there. And when you stepped outside, you felt like you were inside because everything was just walled off, concrete, So it's just these environments where I think there's like a great opportunity to work with the community and bring in green space in this kind of alternative way. So that's it. I've gotten so much help with this. These sculptures are so much bigger than anything I've ever tried before. And my friends and family have put in countless hours. So thank you to my parents, Brad and Carla, and the cameraman helped me immensely. Yeah, my advisors, Susan, Isabel, and Drew, you guys have been so awesome. Yeah, thank you everyone so much. Any questions?
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
First of all, this is very inspiring and exciting work to see. Like, I really like the use of the word like frog leaping and imagining into the future at the very beginning. Like, that's just really inspiring to see. But I had a question about thinking about these sculptures, like especially imitating nature and natural forms. I feel like the one thing that is really almost impossible to replicate, especially with like metalworking and different mediums that we've used is like the decaying process and like the regeneration process. And so how have you thought about that through like sculpture, just like long-term, how these sculptures would interact with the natural world?
Yeah, so I forgot to bring these in, so there's a few sculptures. What else has the door here I'm going to grab? So, yeah, thankfully, because people are destroying dead wood and throwing it out so much, I can kind of, I don't have to feel bad about taking it and using it in sculptures. But, this one has this rope that I've soaked in concrete that's wrapped around the dead wood. So as the wood itself decays, it will leave this hollow shell of the form behind.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely thinking about how that decay interacts with the sculpture and trying to like really use that. Really using natural objects that can decay is kind of the answer.
And on the same vein, like with this specific sculpture on campus, and with just other hollow tree sculptures, once the tree itself is like starting to decay, what do you imagine for like those surrounding objects?
Yeah, so some of them I specifically made, I have an idea to do kind of like a giant like rib cage around one, so as it decays it'll be this skeleton that's left behind. I think allow it to work that way. This one from the museum, and one of the things I think is really promising is these sculptures can stabilize the tree because a lot of them are removed for safety reasons. And if it can kind of take away that concern, be like, this thing is supported. There's an engineering firm that helps me kind of come up with a structural support that would be safe for this one. Just imagining what it's going to do over time as it decays. If a sculpture can be left behind, that's one thing. If another dead tree can be brought in and just kind of like filled in the space, that's another option.
Cool.
And then just deinstalling the sculpture, at a certain point. Is another thing.
Thank you.
What? Yeah, so this is a little stump that someone was throwing away, and I kind of like carved the stump and like added wood chunks to it until it was round, and then this is kind of one of those experimental concrete mix things. So instead of using concrete is cement, sand, and gravel typically. So instead of using sand and gravel, I used wood dust and wood chips. So this is like a very porous material, has a lot of nutrients in it, and just kind of seeing like how little cement I can use to just like bind this stuff together. So it's pretty cool. There's little seedlings popping up out of this. There's like lichens in here, and this was trying to create like a specific microclimate by having this open, so it just really traps water in there, and just seeing what comes out of that. And this one, these are both actually part of a larger sculpture where they're holding up their arms because they're kind of holding up this dead tree that's going to be in the middle. Probably not literally, but just like. Yeah.
So I can hardly express how wonderful this is. And I think it's fair to say, as a staff member who's been here for quite a while, even on the COA campus, it is a real struggle to get people to realize how important just leaving things alone can be, and especially deadwood. It's been a struggle to say,
we don't like deadwood, and that's what attracts all the birds.
right. And so, and we don't have a policy about it, right? So there are many, and then we don't have a fund for taking care of trees, because we could actually take a dead tree down to 30 feet or 20 feet, And I'm sure that that's replicated everywhere. So I guess my question is, how do you see your role in terms of publicity and education beyond just creating these wonderful exhibits? Like, for instance, when your opening happens in fall, will there be news coverage? You know, how do you see your communication between being an artist and a scientist and getting the word out?
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm really excited about, because it's just like, in the research I've been reading, there's, everyone's like, oh, save dead wood, we've got to educate the public, and, but you don't really see a lot being done. So I'm just really excited to be a dead wood advocate through the sculpture, and just, everything that's written about the sculpture, I'm just, putting in a little plug, maybe in your yard you can leave dead wood, and just, I don't know where that's going to go, because it's just kind of putting it out there, trying to educate people, hoping to get people to change the decisions they make and leave dead wood. But I just think it's an avenue for getting that publicity that I think could be pretty powerful.
I could see in the future that you might collaborate with somebody who's the communicator beyond, who works with you to bring the sculpture into a wider exposure.
Definitely, yeah. I didn't get to collaborate with scientists in this project as much. I feel like he was doing a lot of the learning that would be kind of a precursor, so that I can really talk to the researchers and be able to understand what's going on. But for the future projects, that's definitely going to be a part of it. Yeah.
Yes, hi. I just think this is brilliant. And being an artist, I really appreciate your aesthetic, and it's beautiful. I teach sometimes, you were mentioning cities, and they are sterile environments, and working with children and whatnot. I was thinking about your molds and your templates, and have you considered, I know you're just in the learning stages and designing stages, but maybe creating either a template or a book or a learning or something that people could purchase to bring into the educational systems, or to bring into communities where they could create something based on your designs, and create an environment in a park or in a school. Have you? I'm sure
Yeah.
might have thought of that, but because with the printing, they could do the computer printing of your templates. And,
Yeah, so there's two ways I've thought about that. One is the thesis document itself is kind of this, more scholarly, formatted kind of thing, but I want to try and take that and translate it into something that can be accessible and, kind of a resource. So I kind of structured the thesis that way a little bit, with, thinking about it in the future to make this more of a trendy thing. And then for the future sculpture projects, to just make them, the primarily collaborative projects with schools and different age groups.
well, like for instance, the artist Solovitz. Well, anyway, people can purchase. He does everything with these geometric patterns that are murals, and you can purchase at some level his design and bring it in. And people have been painting them in lobbies and things, and I guess some royalty goes back to him. But so if you had a template with your molds of something that children and communities could use, it would be really fabulous, because it could spread. So you do all the individual work, or your guild or whatever. You could have other people with mushroom, I think, faster than it.
Totally, and I'm much more comfortable with rubber molds and plaster molds and stuff. That's just kind of like what I know, but I can definitely see that 3D scanning and 3D printing is, the future of how sculpture is being done. And so I think, collaborating with maybe someone skills, that would be definitely an awesome thing to do. Just spread it out there. And,
Get it into the cities
yeah,
where it's well needed.
yeah,
Thank you for doing this work.
yeah.
Yeah, a mechanical question. How did you cut these? They're beautiful. These sculptures, how did you cut those?
Yeah, this is kind of my go-to method is plasma cutting. So it's just a little handheld torch. It shoots out, it turns the air into plasma, which is the substance the sun is made of, and just kind of shoots a very fine stream of it.
Okay.
So it's just click and I just draw.
Got it.
Yeah.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. And I've been doing it a long time, so I can really control the details. These things are mostly just like construction tools that people use to like cut.
Yeah. They're crazy beautiful. I'm very impressed.
Okay, I have a question. What is your, can you talk a little bit about your thought process in creating these and like what is your, I guess I'm curious about how you're designing these as little ecologies. Like, are you thinking like, do you start with a specific like, you know, insect, like, okay, I want to create this habitat for this creature here because it's needed? Or do you think, like, yeah, like what's your, do you look at the ecosystem that the sculpture is going to be in and then say, okay, how can I regenerate this more? Like, what's your thought process there?
Yeah, there's so many different ways you can go about it, and I've kind of played around with a lot of different stuff. In general, I think of these, I want them to be assemblages of creatures rather than targeting a specific creature. So like birdhouses and bat boxes and bee hotels, you know, these are all things that have a specific creature they're targeting. And when a bunch of insects inhabit a bird box that was meant for a bluebird, then it's seen as a failure. You know, this wasn't designed well. This is no good. We got to clean it out. But in habitat sculptures, I want a full array to be part of it. So it's kind of a different approach that has different opportunities there. So I'll pick out. What this is here. I might pick out things to target certain creatures. Like, I can say there's a certain bird, there's a certain cavity size that they like, but these bars show all the overlap. So, maybe I can choose one from here, and it will, be home to all these creatures, and maybe a larger size here that has this big range of things. So I might start from a individual species, something that's endangered, something of concern, but then kind of widen it out from there and kind of use that as a starting point. Cool. Yeah. It's definitely an open question, how to go about that and what different things you want to achieve.
The sculpture that took us at the museum is really common stuff that lots of people will see from lots of different places. How have you thought about how it's being interpreted so that people can really understand what's going on and maybe be inspired to say how elsewhere?
Yeah, that's obviously such an important part, and I'm going to be working with Carrie to really figure that out through the fall. There's lots of different ideas. So we were talking about having a sheet that has these silhouettes and the name of the species, and then something down next to it, just like a long sheet, so you can really look at the tree and find it and see it that way. But definitely some sort of information there to like what's going on. I would love to do like an augmented reality thing where you could like look at it and tell you things. That's a little, that might be a little much for this project, but that's obviously a key area. Yeah.
And just a response to that as well, I think because this is such a long-term installation, there'll be lots of potential for future students to create additional interpretation, perhaps even programming, collaborations with schools, that sort of thing. in the future.
Yeah.
So, I think someone here was asking about, what happened, did you use the existing environment for part of your inspirations in collaborating with the environment, but you're also looking at these as urban augmentation. Where does that crossover, where does that fade out? Because you might install something where the natural habitat is so gone that the creatures are gone. So how are you thinking about that crossover?
Yeah, that's another area where there's a lot of different approaches you could take. I could go and survey an area for a long time and see what's there and bring in something that's going to support those things that are already there. And that's one approach. Something that's just like totally decimated, and maybe there's just only like a few invasive species and general species there. There's a bit of a build it and they will come thing going on, but looking at one of the things I learned doing the coursework in ecology and biology is like how important the larger landscape is and like patterns going on there. So having a sculpture installation and maybe doing some work to have some connectivity to a surrounding forest patch, something like that, approaching different property owners along a route and saying, can I plant this host plant for this species? And, just kind of looking at larger scales. And, yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, along those same lines, I was really interested in your thesis paper when you address sort of like the problems that might be encountered with attracting invasive species and like animals that people perceive of as pests in an urban environment, unwanted insects or, whatever. So can you talk a little bit more about that and like maybe cite some examples of things? Yeah,
so it's just a really tough question. There are no like solid good answers. So, this is fine. This is taken care of this way. It really has to be monitoring, seeing what's going on. If something is hosting a highly invasive organism, maybe decommissioning it, has to be on the table, and plugging entrances. So it is a big risk because invasive species are usually so successful because they can exploit a lot of different environments and habitats. And these things are by nature, very different than natural objects. So there's going to be a proclivity there to attract invasive species. And it's just, there are certain measures you can take. So there's for cavity nesting wasps and bees, which most of our native species are cavity nesters, there's a couple invasive species that are like the big problem ones. And I found out what those are in this region, found out what the size of the cavities they like, and those are just going to be excluded from the sculptures to kind of cut down on that risk. So there's lots of, looking at the specific cases and doing things like that, I guess is one solution. And then the pest thing is another really tricky issue because some people are just not going to like a certain thing. You can tell them, oh, this is not actually a mosquito, it doesn't bite, this is a fungus gnat, which are these things that I really fall in love with. But, they're not going to care. So it's like you can't, you can educate and you can make things beautiful to a certain degree, but it's just going to have to see what's happening in the real world and respond from there.
So I think at this point, we'll give them another round of applause from our